and welcome to another episode of the Presumption podcast. Hi, Jim. Hi, Matt.
Hey. Hey,
Sarah. How are you?
Good. How are you guys?
Doing great.
You know, I'm doing really good. I'm excited for you guys. I've been making and releasing podcasts for many, many years, but we just launched your first podcast. How are you guys feeling about it? Well, it seems like we've been getting great feedback, but what do you guys think?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, no, very positive reviews. One of my daughters wanted to know why we didn't talk about her in the last episode, and only the oldest daughter. But other than that, it's been great.
I think your daughters are doing that, the audio monitoring where you're like looking for the keyword and the audio footage. They're just looking for their own names, I think, right?
It's hard having 4 children. They all want equal time.
And 3 girls. You are like quite the girl dad. So yeah, I think it's been great. One thing that for me is interesting about the podcast is that of all the years that I've done media, I've always been under a time constraint. I've always been under sort of, parameters of what POV to take and whatnot. And so I like this idea of sort of having free reign to talk with you guys and our guests. And today we have a very special interview, our first guest. So make sure you stay tuned, because after the break, you're going to hear from Father Edward Beck, who really blessed us with this interview, blessed our podcast, and had some very, very interesting things to share, both in the context of the presumption of innocence and maybe guilt, and also just within the Catholic Church, delayed reporting, a lot of interesting issues. And of course, Matt and I were the 2 sore thumbs in this interview. Matt's the Jew, I'm the agnostic, and it was really fun. So please stay tuned for Father Beck after the break. But Jim, tell our viewers what Crime Time is. We kind of came up with this title, but we're doing this Crime Time, right, Jim?
Yeah, so
this is where you guys are going to commit crimes on a podcast for people to hear live, right?
No, I mean, yeah.
Damn. All right.
Yeah, some people may say it's criminal what we're doing out here, but no, we're not going to commit crimes on the podcast. What we're doing is reviewing, 1 or 2 cases that have made headlines during the week, and we're going to spend a few minutes giving our listeners and viewers our insight based upon our over 55 years of doing criminal defense work. And so and we call it Crime Time. Down the road, I think we're going to devote some, episode or portions of episode to, war stories, share some of our experiences. And I don't know if we've come up with a name for that yet. So it's a work in progress, but here we go. Crime Time.
I think, Jim, podcasts take their own life, right? I mean, you start out one way and then you kind of think, well, it works, it doesn't work. Viewers also give us their feedbacks. We got some really great questions this past week by email. And so, make sure you subscribe and you follow and you comment, because we do look and we try our best to listen. So today, Jim, for this first Crime Time,
I got some background, Sarah, if I can I share the case here for you guys?
Please.
So I want to hear you guys' thoughts. We've got this Kouri Richins. She's the Utah mom. She was charged with 1st-degree murder and the death of her husband, allegedly poisoned him with a lethal dose of fentanyl. I think I saw something that was like a Moscow Mule. It's a delicious way to go. But what drew national attention to the story was that this woman also published a children's book about dealing with the grief of losing a parent. And this is kind of maybe the least of her problems, but a lot of bad evidence is coming in, including at the bail hearing, which I think I saw took something like 4 hours. And there were like victim impact statements. I don't know a ton about this, but I assume you save that stuff for the end of the trial, not before it even begins. But where do you guys come down all of this?
Look, Jim, you and I have done, I don't know how many, countless detention hearings in state and federal court. It's not, unprecedented, but it's also not common to have a 4-hour detention hearing with multiple witnesses that they're all put up by the prosecution because the presumption of release is on the side of the defendant. I mean, if there's, if the court is supposed to rule in favor of the defendant in a bail hearing to the extent possible, if there's terms and conditions that will ensure the defendant is not a danger of the community, is not a flight risk, then some sort of set of terms and conditions and amount of money is supposed to secure their appearance. And so this was very unusual. Do you agree?
In a way, I mean, what you have here is cameras in the courtroom. You have, a very high profile case for the reasons that Matt said. I mean, the woman wrote a children's book, a grief book over the death of her husband and father of her children. So, in that context, the judge, the prosecutor knows there's going to be a lot of eyes on what they do. And so I think they wanted to be careful and take their time with it. Are they showboating for the cameras? That'll be, I guess we'll all have to wait and see there. But,
but I think, Jim, one of the things that I said, I first learned about this case and I talked about it on News Nation, where I'm a legal analyst, on Cuomo's show. And they all jumped at me. Cuomo even texted me and said, she's guilty. She's guilty. But I said that there's a big hole in this case in terms of causation. You and I both have a lot of fentanyl cases resulting in death. And, this woman, Kouri Richins, bought fentanyl from who appears to be her housekeeper and a drug dealer. And then 6 days later, what they're saying is that 6 days later is when Eric, her husband, is allegedly poisoned by her with that fentanyl. So that, there's a big 6-day hole in causation. We don't know if that fentanyl is the fentanyl that killed Eric 6 days later. He could have overdosed. It could have been accidental. It could have come from somewhere else. So initially I said I could see that no criminal record, and sort of some weaknesses in the case, she could potentially get some sort of bond. So I also think, aside from the show and the high profile nature of the case, I also think the prosecution felt like they need to fill in some of these holes. I guess, in terms of the evidence to support detention.
Sure. Now, you were dead on it when you said there are a lot of accidental fentanyl death cases. I think Prince was an accidental fentanyl death case. The street level fentanyl is so dangerous because you don't know what the potency is. And so so it could have been completely accidental. People are saying that Eric Richins did not have a history of drug use. Well, everyone said Alec Murdaugh didn't have a history of drug use. You just don't know whether people are addicted and if he got a fatal, dose of fentanyl.
Yeah.
But, to your point about bond hearing, in general, there's a presumption you get bond. In capital cases is the opposite. And this is a capital case. And so the standard there in Utah that the judge was applying is if there's a substantial evidence to support the charge, then he still has discretion to grant bail, but it's a much
higher standard
hurdle. So much higher standard. And so that's
good point. I didn't know that about Utah law. One of the things that you and I, one of the reasons we were sort of, we set out to do this podcast, aside from the presumption of innocence and the role of media and on that presumption, it's also to dive into the lost disease of addiction and mental illness in criminal justice and in criminal cases. And addiction is a secret disease. It's right. A fatal disease, and it's very much secret. So I always laugh when people say, "Oh, we spoke to his family and they said he never had a problem." Yeah, his family would be the last to know, especially family that doesn't live with him, But the defense, I think, did a pretty good job. Matt, I don't know how much of that, it was long. It was like 4 hours, but I thought the defense did a really good job of essentially discrediting the cooperator, who is that drug dealer / housekeeper. Cooperators always come with credibility issues. She has apparently a pretty fat record of charges and things that are pending, things that she's trying to work off. And so the defense, without really, it's not what they would do at trial, obviously, but they did a good job at this stage to discredit what she had provided to law enforcement, and essentially made a point that she made statements that fit the narrative of law enforcement. She told law enforcement what she believed they want to hear to give her some leniency with respect to her own legal troubles.
Yeah, and so the question is, was the drug purchased for habit, pleasure, or was for murder? I mean, that
Yeah.
Were they, did they take drugs as part of their routine? Is that something that they did? I mean, people take fentanyl for a lot of reasons, addiction mostly, but any event.
What is it actually for? You guys have handled a lot of fentanyl cases, but in terms of like the reason that people would be interested in doing it, because all I hear is that you take a dropper's worth, you're going to die. Like, why would anyone take it?
I mean, you could. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, and so it's it's like heroin, but it's not made from the poppy seed. It's made in a lab, and so
Gotcha.
same reason you take heroin, you take fentanyl.
Gotcha.
No, but there is medical grade fentanyl that is administered in the hospital.
Sure.
And so that's, under supervision, it's medical grade, you're watched, you're monitored. It's a different story, but you bring that into a situation where it's laced, you think you're using marijuana, or you think you're using just a regular oxy pill that you bought black market, and suddenly it's laced with fentanyl. And I just recently, my goddaughter's one of her best friends, who I obviously knew because of her, really great kid, probably had never touched drugs until he got into college, just dropped dead because I'm not sure what he was experimenting with, but it was definitely not a habit for him. And like you said, Matt, one use and you're gone. So
it's just so you get raw fentanyl from China or Mexico is where most of it comes from a lab, and a drop could kill a horse. But what they do is they, drug dealers, they bind it with some mixer, and then they dilute it, and they crush it, and they put it in pill presses for the most part, and they make a pill out of it, or you can have it in powder form. But what happens is that the potency is not uniform across the mixture. And so you can get a very highly concentrated mixture and you die. I mean, there's a lawyer here in South Carolina who died on New Year's Day for this very reason. I mean, people are dropping dead all the time from accidental overdoses of fentanyl. Was this such a case? Not. I mean, that will have to be played out in a court in front of a jury, apparently. But
well, the allegation is that he had 5 times the lethal level was because it was 5 times more than what normally would kill somebody.
And that means nothing. I mean, that just means
right. I mean, a lot of these cases we challenge based on the toxicology that is done on the, at the same time as the autopsy. And I have a case currently of pending sentencing in federal court. My client's, his nephew's wife was the victim. But she had other things in her system. And initially, when, a couple of years ago, the case started, in his mind, his defense was, well, I took the same thing and I took 4 of those pills that same day. And, here I am, I'm living. And I'm like, it could be in conjunction with the other things in the person's system. It could just be, and in that case, the levels were not fatal. They were highly toxic. So that is, I mean, I think the toxicology is one thing that we for sure look at very carefully using our own experts to try to see whether it's even the cause of death, and that nexus has to be absolutely drawn, which is why I was saying there's a hole in this case. But Jim, one of the things that's really important for both of us is timeline. You had a huge timeline problem in Murdoch, but time matters, when matters, and context matters. And so with respect to the timeline here, you and I were talking about this earlier today, that Kouri Richins had done a lot of internet searches, and everyone's like, oh my God, they're so bad. Not really. I'm going to read some of them. What is a lethal fentanyl dose? Luxury prisons for the rich in America. Women, Utah prison. Can cops force you to do a lie detector test? Death certificate says pending. Will life insurance still pay? FBI analysis of electronics in an investigation. When does the FBI get involved in a case? How long does life insurance companies taken to pay? How to permanently delete information from an iPhone remotely? What do you say to that, Jim?
Well, all that sounds really bad, Sarah, except for the fact that that was the Google history search from her replacement phone after law enforcement has seized her phone, after she knew she was the target of the investigation. And so those questions would be something that my clients would be asking me.
Right. Right.
What's a lethal dose of fentanyl? If I go to prison, where am I going to go?
I gotta just
she was researching her demise. She wasn't researching in preparation for murder. But I was never a prosecutor like you, Jim, but I'm going to try to pretend. Okay. There are two searches that I think are bad, even though they were after. One is the remote deleting her phone, the destroying evidence, and whether cops can force you to take a polygraph. Can those be explained? I mean, how would you explain those to a jury?
That'd be fair questions to ask. I'm not going to argue with you. Those are problematic questions. I mean, those are obstruction of justice type questions. How can I obstruct their investigation? But
related to this, I have to ask, because I do a lot of true crime writing, and my Google search history is insane, because I'm literally Googling, like, how do you properly bury a person? What temperature does flesh melt when it burns? Like, I'm only doing this because I'm researching. Am I going to get in trouble? Should I be editing this out of the podcast? That's my question.
Now, Matt, I have started listening to your podcast. I don't know how you sleep at night, because I mean, you cover some pretty gruesome crimes. So yeah.
Yes, pretty horrific stuff. But again, not knowing much about the law of it, I would think that just looking at somebody's Google internet search doesn't seem like it would hold much water, even if the reasons that you're explaining too, like she's looking this stuff up later. She's just researching stuff.
But
I mean, it's your job. I mean, if you were accused of a crime, you really have a good defense on the Google searches, because that's what you do for,
Sarah, one thing about this polygraph, we'll know that evidence will never get in front of a jury. It should not, because
it's not admissible.
Polygraphs are not admissible. What they did in this detention hearing, they put it right in front of the potential jurors and have it disseminated in the public, and we're talking about it. Yeah. And polygraphs are not even, designed to determine the truth. I mean, it's not admissible for that. It's an investigative tool. We've all had experiences where a law enforcement officer tells your client, "Oh, you've got real problems on the polygraph," when in fact they had no problems on the polygraph. But it's
but
just
you know what? There's a difference between, and this is why it's interesting for Jim and I to do this podcast, because our jurisdictions are so incredibly different. Not what we do in federal court, that's our common denominator, but in state court, in California, a lot of my clients ask, well, what if I take a polygraph and you show it to the DA? Would they consider not charging me? We don't even bring it up, because it's just not what we do here. It's worthless. But I know that in South Carolina, you mentioned that sometimes your prosecutors are open to factoring that into their charging decision, right?
It comes up. I don't do it. I don't believe in polygraphs at all. And I've, I can, maybe when we tell war stories, I got some great war stories about polygraphs. But so, I actually had a case where I had a victim of a sexual assault, and it was by the victim's father, and I was representing the victim, and the victim and the prosecutor, the investigators wanted the father to take a polygraph. And the father said, "Well, I'll take a polygraph if my daughter will take a polygraph." And she said, "Absolutely, but he's got to go first." And the day that he was supposed to take the polygraph, he chickened out. And so,
So what about, Jim? There was also evidence that Kouri had attempted to poison Eric before and failed because Eric had said to someone else, I think she tried to poison me because he felt really ill, etc. What do you think of the evidentiary weight of that?
I mean, will that come into evidence in front of a jury? I don't know. I mean, that's pretty tenuous. How does he know she tried to do that?
Right.
I mean, what's the basis for that?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, those are tough evidentiary questions. I mean, you've got, you've got someone who's dead now. He can't testify, and so it's hearsay, and it's someone saying. Now there are exceptions to that: present state of mind, or present sense impression, or So there may be evidentiary rules that allow it to be admitted, but so you can't say that's going in front of the jury.
Yeah.
But some of the other evidence is just kind of ridiculous, in my opinion. They found
the financial motive, right? Financial motive is always a bad thing. Motive is not an element of crime, but everyone wants to know why. Why matters to a jury. And so here it's obvious from this evidentiary hearing for 4 hours, they put on a forensic investigator to testify about she was in like dire financial struggle. And so she had motive. She was looking at Eric's death as hitting the jackpot, essentially. But
he had taken her off his life insurance policy, correct?
Right, but she wasn't aware of that.
Okay. Well, who says that? Who says she wasn't aware of that?
I mean, I saw that in reporting that apparently she was not aware that she'd been taken off, but she had tried to add herself on after he had taken her off, unbeknownst to her, right? She didn't know she was even on. She was trying to add herself on. So, and for him, he had her on and he had removed her, right? So there's a little bit of that. But you have to also understand that you had his sister making a victim impact statement at this evidentiary hearing, which to me, that was really kind of, novel because I usually see victim impact statements at sentencing, not regarding detention. But essentially she was saying she's a danger to the children, she should be locked up, etc. That sister has a dog in the fight because that sister is in a heated financial battle in a probate proceeding with Kouri. And so they're trying to make her look like a broke, desperate, evil woman who had motive to kill for money. And it looks from, again, what the defense attorneys were doing, that there's going to be a huge issue for the jury to decide, is that was she really broke or was she a successful business owner and money was just flowing in and out? Sometimes maybe she had less money, but for the most part, she had access to money. Right. And I, that was an issue in Murdoch where June 7th, the storm was not coming. It was actually another day in Alec Murdoch's financial life. It was just, he was dealing with what he was dealing with financially. And so I thought that was interesting for you because you just dealt with that.
Well, it comes up in every case, right? I mean,
yeah.
Particularly in spousal death cases, right. Someone have something to gain. But this is a really, really interesting case. We're going to be following it going forward for sure.
100%. And once it goes to trial, we will be doing full episodes to unpack the week in trial. We'll do that for Kohberger. We'll do that for Richins. We'll do that for, all these cases that are in the headlines. So there's going to be a lot of episodes where it's me and Jim and Matt. So buckle up.
And just a reminder, people listening out there, you could subscribe to this podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Google, we're everywhere. You can also follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/@thepresumption. And that's also our handle for Twitter and Instagram @thepresumption. And as Sara mentioned earlier, we'd love to hear from you guys. Email us questions, thepresumptionpod@gmail.com. The Presumption.
And we'll be right back with Father Edward Beck.
And before we cut away, you're going to be listening to music by Caleb Fletcher. And thank you, Caleb, for giving this to us.
Welcome back to The Presumption with me and Jim Griffin. And today we have a very, very, very special guest, our first guest ever on The Presumption, and that's Father Edward Beck. Father Beck, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for letting me be your first guest.
I mean, you're truly blessing our podcast. There's a lot to say about Father Beck, but I'm going to do my best to hit on the highlights. Father Beck, I met in green rooms and also through our mutual friend, Chris Cuomo. But he is way more than just a priest, and has a lot more to offer than his beautiful blue piercing eyes. I'm surprised he's not matching, because he's usually matching a blue shirt with his beautiful eyes. But you've seen him on TV. You've seen him on multiple platforms. He is a Roman Catholic priest, an author, a playwright, and television commentator. He's published 3 books and written 2 plays. The most recent one I've had the honor of attending readings of multiple times on both coasts. It's called Ungodly Pursuit, starring Vanessa Williams. And it'll soon be in full production, which is super exciting. And for the past 15 years, Father Beck has worked in mainstream media as an on-air correspondent for religion, faith, and ethics, a lot of which we're going to be talking about today. He was at ABC and co-hosted a weekly show with Chris Cuomo. He was seen on Fox and MSNBC and many other networks. And most recently, starting from 2013 to I think till 2022 or till 2023.
Just this past April.
This past April, yeah. He was the exclusive faith and religion correspondent for CNN, which is where I met him. So again, welcome, Father Beck. And thanks for blessing us today with an important conversation. So before I toss this to Jim, because Jim is, I'm the agnostic, Matt is the Jew, Jim is the man of faith, along with you, Father Beck. And so before I toss it to Jim for like very detailed questions that Matt and I probably have no idea about,
we're just gonna sit back and let Jim take the rest of the show. We'll be chilling.
Right. I do have a couple of questions about how religion and Christianity, in one case, has peeped its head in a big way in the defense and for the prosecution in a couple of very high-profile cases that we've seen play out in trial most recently. It's really colored the trial of Lori Vallow, who's also known as the cult mom in Idaho. She was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to murder in Idaho of her 2 young children and her husband's ex-wife, and then also her own ex-husband she's going to be on trial for in Arizona. And even though she was controlling her defense in that case, according to reports, the defense really throughout the trial made points about, through eliciting in cross-examination testimony from different witnesses as to whether her beliefs and her practices were religious because she was a Christ follower in the Church of the Latter-day Saints. She was a Mormon, or was she the cult mom and doing these crazy evil things that her husband and co-defendant was essentially preaching and influenced her to do. So what was your reaction to the crossing of that line between being a Christ follower and an evil worshiper?
Well, I don't think they have anything to do with one another. I think there was obviously psychological illness here, and whatever she got wrapped up in was evil or mental illness. I mean, it had nothing to do. There's certainly nothing in Mormonism or the Church of Latter-day Saints that would condone anything that she did. And you may not believe all the tenets of Mormonism or adhere to them, but I mean, it is a peace-loving religion. And when you describe cult behavior, it's a little different from traditional religion and religious practice. I mean, I suppose you can make the argument that all religions are cultish in some nature. In other words, really the root of the word is worship. So all religious traditions worship something or adhere to some common fundamental beliefs. I think the fruits, though, of those religious traditions are, do they produce good, love, forgiveness, compassion, mercy? And if not, if murder and mayhem and destruction is the result, then I think you can say that that is not of God from my perspective. And
well, as Lori Vallow saying, no, it is an act of love to kill my two young children because they were possessed by the devil. And the way that I could free them is by essentially expelling this devil, whatever, inside of them. And I think she said that to her son. She said, her oldest son, she said, those two kids knew I did them, it was, what I did was good. Essentially, I saved them. And so you're saying that's mental illness, right?
yes, and that's a distortion of any kind of religious belief. And, really, I don't think there's anything in Mormonism to justify it. And certainly in the other voices she may have heard, I think that comes from her own misguided psyche.
And my second question, Father Beck, is on the Danny Masterson case. Actor, big figure in the Church of Scientology. Well, first of all, is that a church?
Well, again, I don't want to disparage any churches that want to call themselves churches. I mean, I think that you can look at any organization and find fault with the beliefs. I mean, Roman Catholicism, I've been called a cannibal for believing that we consume the body and blood of Christ. So from my perspective, what I've seen of Scientology, though, I have some questions about the practices and the fruits of the practices, such as intimidation, such as threatening others, such as doing extensive cover-ups to protect criminals. Now, again, some could say, well, the Roman Catholic Church did the same thing. So I think that it's very hard to say that a religious tradition, without really knowing it inside out or being part of it, is necessarily a cult or religion or to disparage religious practices. When I look at the tenets of Scientology, they don't make sense to me. They don't resonate as true. But that's my perspective. I think certain Scientologists would dispute that, and others who have left Scientology would say, no, that's a misguided organization that has nothing to do with religion. So again,
and one such person, a woman who left after many years the Church of Scientology, was qualified as an expert in Masterson's trial, which really made a huge, because remember, this was the second time he's tried. The first time it was a hung jury. The second time, this woman got to testify as an expert on Scientology to say that the Church of Scientology has its own internal justice system and condemns anybody who goes to law enforcement to report a crime, especially, if the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator is a high figure, which there's a lot of them in that Church of Scientology. So essentially this woman filled in the blank for the defense, which was, the defense was saying this was consensual and this happened decades ago, and now they're coming forward and screaming rape when they actually consented. And part of it was they waited so long to report it. This woman was able to explain to the jury that no, they didn't. They reported it internally. The church didn't do anything about it. And then when they went out to law enforcement, they were essentially expelled.
Sarah, would you like to play that clip that we pulled of this?
Yeah, play that clip, and then I want Father Beck and Jim to talk about this idea in the Catholic Church that relates to delayed reporting.
Sure thing. Here's the Scientology expert.
Scientology has a decades of history of denying any allegations of wrongdoing. But the fact of the matter is that the evidence presented in this trial resulted in a guilty verdict. There was no delay in reporting these crimes because they were reported to Scientology, of which there was extensive reports in many different files within Scientology. And so true to what they always do, they're denying it. But there are thousands and thousands of policies that outline disdain for law enforcement, disdain for the judicial system, and that crimes are to be reported within Scientology. In fact, it is a high crime to report a Scientologist to outside law enforcement. And what a high crime means is that it can result in the person being expelled, which means they would lose their family, their friends, their job, anything, any connections to Scientology, they would be completely pushed out. So it's very clearly delineated in Scientology policies, and there are thousands that cover it.
Rings a bell, no?
No, I mean,
No?
it rings no bell with Roman Catholicism. For me, it's never been that you are punished if you
Right.
report something that was criminal.
Mhm.
What happened before 2002, however, is that there was criminal activity of sex abuse that was discovered internally
Mhm.
that should have, by bishops, been reported, and in all instances, in some instances, were not reported by those bishops. But that was their error and their mistake, not that the religion says don't report it or you'll be ostracized if you do. And since 2002 and zero tolerance, it's mandatory that any accusation, whether it be criminal or not, be reported to civil law enforcement authorities and investigated.
What happened in 2002 that changed?
It was called the Dallas Charter. It was really after the Boston Globe expose about the Archdiocese of Boston and the, spotlight that group of the Boston Globe uncovered instances of sexual abuse in the church that had gone unreported, or that priests were just moved from parish to parish who were still abusing. And as a result of that meeting in 2002, after that, the church policies of mandatory reporting, no matter what, were enforced.
Father Beck, in every criminal case that we get, the timing of the reporting is very important. And as we develop a defense, the delayed reporting, is something that defense lawyers use to challenge the credibility of the report. If it happened, why did you wait? And what we're seeing, I believe, in many instances, the explanation of the delayed reporting, they want to blame it on their religious faith as sort of a defense. And I do know that church doctrine, not necessarily just the Roman Catholic Church, but I had experience in some criminal litigation involving securities cases out of Utah, where the the members of the Latter-day Saints, their doctrine was to take it inside the church, deal with it inside the church. The Bible teachings for us in the Christian faith are, really don't judge one another. Go to your brother, address him, and try to forgive him and correct him or her. And so, are you concerned that as cases go forward that religion is going to be blamed more so because of delayed reporting, and that's going to undermine the efforts of the Roman Catholic Church or other religions as they try, to worship, in the way that they choose?
Well, Jim, I think there are a few distinctions to be made here, and especially with regard to delayed reporting. Now, there have been instances where, say, a priest has been dead for 30 years, and an accuser of that priest comes forward after statutes of limitations, or even if they're within that particular state's statute of limitations, and said, this happened to me 30 years ago with this person. Well, the person is dead. There aren't necessarily any witnesses. There have been a few cases that I know of where there were no witnesses at all. It was this person against the dead persons. They wanted a settlement, a monetary settlement. And in a lot of instances, religious communities did pay for counseling and go ahead with some kind of settlement. Now, is that good? Is it justified? I don't know. Maybe you can come down on both sides of that argument. The accuser is still living and says this happened. The accused
Right.
is dead. So that is delayed reporting, and where there's no chance at defense. And when there's delayed reporting, psychologists will say sometimes someone doesn't come to this recovered memory till their 40s or their 50s. And so that's why delayed reporting on the part of the accuser, I'm saying,
Sure.
is something that I think needs to be considered. There should be no delayed reporting with regard to religious institutions, however. Religious institutions, when they discover criminal activity of any kind, it needs to be reported immediately. That's the policy of the Roman Catholic Church, and that should be the policy of any institution.
So, Father Beck, I'm curious if you're doing confession with members of your parish or Catholics, and they confess to you that they have engaged in criminal conduct, say of the worst type, criminal sexual misconduct with a child. I mean, are you required to report it, or are you required to keep it confidential?
No. Roman Catholic priests, to my knowledge, and this would include even psychologists, psychiatrists, and people like you, lawyers, have a mandatory reporting for if someone knows that they're going to be harming themselves or someone else, then you have to report it. That is not true with Roman Catholic priests. In fact, the seal of confession is blanket seal. There is no way. I have actually had someone, report murder to me. I mean, confess murder to me, and wound up being a serial murderer. And I had to deal with that in a way to try to prevent that behavior from occurring and continuing to occur, but I could not report it to legal authorities.
Father Beck, why didn't you call Jim and I?
Why would I call Jim or you? I can't tell anyone.
We could defend him. We're a team here.
You just got to hint around it a little bit. It's like, I know this guy, okay? He's a friend of a friend, but what
actually,
if?
I had that question of like, is there a
confession is speak to no one. You can speak to no one about what anyone says to you in a confessional. If you do, you are excommunicated and your priesthood is removed from you.
What was your, if I may ask, like, what was your sort of initial, in this particular case, when a serial killer is confessing to you, how do you weigh that in your own conscience? Like, I know you have, for lack of a better phrase, a sacred duty to not tell anybody, but instead you have to keep that in your heart. And I just wonder, how do you do that?
I think the way in which I did it and somehow came to peace with it, Jim, was that if that person did not believe in the seal, the ultimate seal of confidentiality, they would have never come to me in the first place. They would not go to a lawyer. They would not go to a psychiatrist. They would not go to anybody else. So at least I had the opportunity to try to intercede, thwart the behavior, get some help, and somehow change the course and trajectory of that. And there's no other profession that I know of where that person could have come to me with some confidence that nowhere else was this going to be reported. And so I think in some ways, while there's a danger to it, because you deal with people who could potentially harm themselves or others, you also are in a privileged position of that person may be the only person that you will go to. Mm-hmm. And at least you have the chance of perhaps doing some good.
Can agnostics come to you to confess?
Only Roman Catholics go to Catholic priests to confess. So, but even if someone who's not Catholic comes and confesses, I'm still under the seal because they come with the intention that I would be keeping the seal.
The one thing about lawyers, though, for us, like Jim and I, we have attorney-client privilege. So if someone comes to us, obviously, like our clients, we know a lot about what they've done. If it's in the past, we have an absolute privilege to keep the communications private. But
if you know they're going to hurt someone or themselves in the future, then you can't.
Of course, we can't. Yeah, that's essentially being complicit in a crime for us. That's amazing. Okay.
So I'll just throw this out, Father Beck. One of my favorite referrals I've ever received was through a Catholic priest during confession. I had a client that was engaged in some criminal misconduct, and she had been confronted by investigators, and she lied to the investigators, and then she went to confess, and then she told the Catholic priest that she was going to go call the investigator back and admit her crimes and tell him that she lied. And the priest said, "No, my child, you need to consult with a lawyer before you do any of that." And he gave her my number, and she comes to my office, and I said, "How'd you get my name?" And she said, "From my priest." And so that was a high day in my legal career, and one I'll never forget. So.
And she may have never made it to you otherwise, correct, Jim?
Oh yeah, she probably would have gone and confessed and made her situation a lot worse. So I'm sure you're confronted with similar situations like that in your capacity. Yes. I know it's tough. Wow.
Jim's trying to nudge you to send us your referrals.
Yes. Send them all this way.
Well, it's not only murderers, of course. I mean, when somebody comes to you about a marriage in trouble or infidelity or not knowing what to do about a particular affair, I mean, it's rarely the case that I would get any criminal activity of someone coming as in criminal activity. It's moral, ethical issues that they're struggling with. And, I think you have the opportunity to do some good in those, especially.
Well, I've had friends tell me that when they've gone to, and this is not in terms of crimes, but just like you said, moral, ethical issues, that they've wronged somebody or they've cheated on their husband or whatever. I've had friends tell me that their priest told them not to say a word because why would you want to hurt that person with something that they don't otherwise know, which I always found, my, non-Catholic brain, I thought, oh my God, if you go and confess, I mean, the idea of confession is not a comfortable thing for those of us who are not religious. I don't know whether it is for even someone who's Catholic, and I'm like, oh my God, you're going to go to this father and say, you did this thing. And then the person says, oh, don't even worry about it. Don't make it known. Like, it's just such a relief. And I never knew that. I thought.
Well, I think there's a difference between don't worry about it, or perhaps in this instance, what you're telling me, revealing this would be worse for your marriage than more helpful to your marriage. And so I'd like to give you perhaps a path by which you do not have to reveal this, but you still have to really work on this marriage and try to make it better. I don't think necessarily revelation to the partner in a case of adultery or affair is always the best remedy.
It's amazing. I have a question along the lines of Jim's question, which is, in a criminal case, we often have to, in fact, most criminal cases resolve in a plea of some sort. And sometimes trial is not a good idea. So we tell our clients that they need to, negotiate a plea agreement with the prosecution. Is pleading guilty a necessary first step to redemption? I mean, if somebody comes to you and says, how do you reconcile those two things? They've committed a crime. Do you counsel them? Do you leave it to the legal process to play out? Or is pleading guilty or owning the crime a first step to redemption?
Well, I'm going to make two distinctions for you here. If someone comes to me in a counseling room, that's not confession. It's different from if they come to me the sacrament of reconciliation, which is confession. So in the sacrament of reconciliation and confession, there has to be true contrition, sorrow, for whatever action you are confessing. In order for you to be absolved, you have to express contrition and the resolve not to commit that same sin and that same error again. Those are the conditions by which I, as a priest, then can absolve you from the sin. So someone coming to me in a counseling room, it's a very different situation. And I think that, again, presumption of innocence or guilt, it depends on what they're talking about. But I think no one's going to come to me unless they think that they're struggling in some way, either they or someone they're involved with is struggling in some way that they need help with. So whether that's wrong or right, whether it's moral, immoral, ethical or not, I mean, that depends on the situation. But for the sacrament itself, there has to be an admission of guilt and a resolve not to commit that same sin again.
Well, okay.
So, Father Beck, this podcast is called The Presumption, and you mentioned the presumption of innocence, and the Boston Globe, investigative story and all that has come to light. What's the situation now in the Catholic Church where a priest is accused, not convicted, but simply accused of engaging in some sort of sexual misconduct?
Yeah, this is so hard, I think, Jim, on both sides. Right now, the policy, the mandatory policy is any accusation requires immediate removal of that priest or that brother from ministry. So if they're in a parish serving as pastor or associate pastor, and any accusation before it's investigated made, that person is removed from ministry, and then an internal investigation begins. If it's criminal activity that's reported, it is also reported to civil authorities while an internal investigation is done concurrently. So you have to realize, say you're a pastor of a parish, and anybody can say anything about you, as you know, accuses you. You are immediately removed from being pastor while that investigation goes on. I know investigations, internal ones, that have gone on a year or 2 years. So it's pretty hard to come back from that if you are in fact innocent and proven innocent, when you have been publicly removed and it's been put in the bulletin that this person has been accused, this priest has been accused of this. Like with any accusation, I mean, that's true across the board. I suppose if you're accused of a crime that you're innocent of, I mean, there's always kind of a pall hanging over you if perhaps you did something wrong. But I think now, with the current environment we're in, the presumption is more guilt than innocence. You have to kind of prove the innocence rather than be convicted of the guilt, I think.
Right. And Father Beck, is that limited to sexual crimes, or is it any like financial misconduct, or are there limitations on that removal?
Well, certainly if it's criminal, any criminal activity needs to be reported, not just sexual. Now, if it's financial, then that's going to be an internal church decision.
I see.
If it's not criminal activity, that they'll do an investigation. They may, in fact, remove while they do that. I mean, I know certainly of instances where pastors have been removed for suspected financial malfeasance, and then the investigation has gone on, and the parish has been made known that was taking place. So again, it depends on whether it's criminal, but Jim, it's not. I mean, if you as a priest are found to be having an affair, a consensual affair, which is breaking your vow or promise of celibacy or chastity, that is grounds for removal. I mean, that's internal violation of the norms and rules of that institution. It's nothing to do with legal. I mean, legally, you're fine, but you're still going to be removed because it's considered a moral or ethical infraction against the institution.
And is the accusation, does it need to be some formal accusation, or is it just simply a parishioner goes to the bishop, for example, and makes the claim privately, and it's not in the public domain? Does that still result in the, I guess, suspension from office of the pastor?
If the accusation that the person is making is criminal in nature, yes. Wow. If it's a third-party accusation like that of someone who's not been the one who something's been perpetrated against, then an internal investigation can occur while that is being investigated, or until the one, say, like as you're saying, a woman comes and tells the bishop, I think that this priest is abusing someone. So what evidence do you have? Well, then they would go to that person that person is saying is being abused, and they would question them. And if they in fact said, yes, that's true, that person is then removed. The priest is then removed.
Right.
But this idea that you just described about essentially the presumption of guilt and then having to prove your innocence, that's really something that Jim and I are seeing in our arena too, which is why we focused on this podcast, and just how much, talking about people that are accused, high profile names that come in the news, and how the media, there's pros and cons, we have media and shows like helping discover bodies and overturn convictions and, find the right suspect in cold cases. But then you also have the idea that people like Brian Koberger, who's simply accused at this point, is now somehow a serial killer. So it's interesting because even though the burden's on the prosecution, we find ourselves doing the work to prove innocence, as opposed to, challenging the prosecution and its burden. I do have a question though.
Sara, just on that one note, I want to be clear though that I think that the policy for us is a good one, because if there is any danger that a child is being abused, I don't think that you can wait for an investigation to occur before that person is removed. So I think you have to presume on the side of perhaps an innocent victim in that sense to protect. Now, again, whether or not that priest is reinstated if found innocent, I mean, that's the later question. But I don't think there's any other way right now other than removal if there is any suspect that there could be veracity to the claim.
But that's removal pending the investigation, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So it's more of a
Being out on bail, I guess, in
suspension.
some ways. I don't know.
Okay. So I just want to know, you know, I typically, Jim, do you boot out conservatives from, I mean, you're in a more conservative jurisdiction, but do you boot out conservatives from your jury as much as possible?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. You know, we are in the heart of the Bible Belt down here, and things have evolved over time. But there's a degree to which religious conservative jurors get stricken by defense lawyers all day long.
Mm-hmm.
But a Pentecostal religious juror who believes that you should not judge your fellow man, who believes that if the rule of law conflicts with the rule of God, that you take the rule of God over the rule of law, and they say that, the prosecution throws them off the case every time. And so it's not a one size fits all. And it's, you know, when I first started practicing law in the late 80s, I mean, there was a lot more religion in the courtroom than there is today. I mean, you know, witnesses swore on the Bible, and lawyers would use the Bible in their closing argument. There are some beautiful Bible verses that are just, you know, absolutely suitable for a lot of types of cases that are, you know, and jurors would resonate and accept that. And so, you know, I do think it's dangerous to ask a lot of religious questions of jurors, and we do in questionnaires, but I do think it's an unfair question, and jurors are getting stricken when they're asked if the judge instructs you to do something that you think conflicts with, you know, your religious beliefs, would you follow the judge's law and the judge's instruction? And, you know, if they're devout religious, follow the teachings of the Bible. I mean, they have to say.
Well, but that's the whole point is if you believe in original sin, how can you reliably presume innocence as a juror, for example? I mean, I'm in LA, so I'm not in the same sort of Bible Belt area that Jim is. So for me, it's like a devout Christian on a potential jury pool is going to stand out to me. Hopefully asking the right questions. And I probably wouldn't want that person on a criminal case that I'm defending. So how do you reconcile original sin with someone who could sit on a jury and say, oh yeah, no, I can presume this person innocent until the prosecution meets its burden, if they do?
Well, because original sin has nothing to do with a particular crime necessarily. It's meaning that we're all flawed humanity. And I think the doctrine of original sin just says that we are not perfect, you know, as our God is perfect. And I mean, that's so it's the sin is really flawed, and it doesn't mean that person, whatever they're being accused of, is guilty of what they're being accused of. But I'm interested, what does replace swearing on the Bible, Jim, in the courtroom? What do people swear to tell the truth?
It's a comic book. It's a Marvel superhero comic book. The court system has just gone crazy.
It is kind of crazy. And so they just now stand up and raise their right hand and say, do you swear or affirm, you know, that you'll tell the truth, the whole truth? But then you say, so help you God. And but I mean, but the Bible, you know, not a lot of courtrooms.
If someone says I don't believe in God, so why am I swearing to God? Do they still have to say that?
Well, they're then affirming, right? Or yeah, they, you know, it really hasn't come up that much where there's a religious dispute as to the taking of the oath, but it is. I mean, you put the Bible, they swear on the Bible, and then, you know, they are then thrown off the courts throw jurors off if they say that God's law is greater than man's law. I mean, it's you know, it's hard to.
What was it? Does a Muslim swear on the Quran? Does
Yeah.
Hindu swear on their the Bhagavad Gita, or what? Who decides
Well,
what they swear on?
yeah, you're right. And so you'll have some jurors say, "I don't swear. I don't swear," and so
Yeah.
then they'll just affirm under penalty of perjury. And so I mean, there are ways around it, but for
Yeah.
sure, it's.
But also witnesses. I mean, we don't. Jim was just asking me. We were talking about this episode, and he was saying, "Do you guys, swear on the Bible?" I was like, "No. The witness has to hold up their hand, and then, so help you God, and that's it." And so, but there are people that don't believe in God, and I mean, I've never come across that where a witness, whether they do or don't, has said, "I'm sorry, I don't have a God." And I think people just go through the exercise as a formality to be able to go take the stand. But
Right.
it would be very interesting to have to put your hand on a book that you know nothing about and don't believe in. So anyway, do we have more for Father Beck?
Well, I'm just an observation, Father Beck, in the South. There are religion works their way into every trial in some form or fashion, and you have different degrees of belief, and over time it has quoting of scripture and during argument to jurors has diminished during the course of my legal career, but I'll just say my experience here in the South and being in the Bible Belt that religion still plays a very significant role in our criminal justice system, and I don't know how much so in California or up in the Northeast where you are, but that's just.
Now, Jim, is that from your perspective a good or a bad thing?
No, I think it's a good thing from my perspective. I think jurors take their oath seriously. They want to tell the truth. They don't want to lie, and under the eyes of God, not so much But
what if the religious belief does conflict with the legal law?
Yeah, so that is. When I prosecuted cases, I had a case once where one juror said, "I'm not going to judge another man." Jesus said, let the one without sin cast the first stone. And so he sat there and read the Bible the whole time. And I put a lot of time and effort, prosecuting the case, and jurors were calling up afterwards saying, "So this person just wouldn't deliberate."
But they should have never been selected as a juror then, right?
Well, it's hard to identify those jurors, frankly, going into it. You don't really know completely. But, by the same token, you have folks who presume people guilty based on, a lot of beliefs. I don't think religion really drives people to presume people or other people are guilty. I think it's a complete opposite. That's my thought.
You think that religion and having religious jurors makes them more empathetic or compassionate towards how another fellow human being could have, because of their flaws?
Well, I hope my hope is, whether it's true or not, is that they're less quick to judge. And I think that's what the Bible teaches us.
Mm-hmm.
Let those without sin cast the first stone. Don't be concerned with a dust speck in another man's eye when you have a plank in yours. I mean, there's all these great parables and that Jesus told.
Aren't you glad, Matt, that we belong? Don't you feel like you belong?
Yes, I do.
You're a child of God. You're being accepted.
Finally, for the first time in my life.
In the Hebrew scriptures, there are all kind of those kind of same fundamental religious dictums. So
very true.
Yeah, Matt, we do in the Bible. We do have an Old Testament. Yes, we do.
The OG, the OG Bible.
I think that, look, Father Beck is either really nice or I don't know. He might think I'm so weird. He just want to say it, but he knows that I wear all kinds of different religious symbols, charms around my neck, and he just
crosses,
of course, yeah. But my name being Sara, I think I told Jim the story. It's it can be anything, and so I had an Orthodox, it was a federal case not too long ago, racketeering case, client who was just kind of he really wanted to stick to his own people. He really it was obvious he preferred to have an orthodox criminal defense attorney representing him. And so he was trying to figure out, so I went to visit him in lockup in the detention center. And he said, Azari, is that, Hebrew? And I was like, could be, I was like, I wasn't saying yes or no. And then he said, well, Sara, that comes from the Torah. And I was like, or the Bible. It's just like, so anyway, my being agnostic, I call it agnostic and flexible.
Well, Sara, to add on to that, Sara in the Bible has a child in her very, very late years. So get ready. There's always hope for you,
That's right. So, Father Beck, I want to just tell you my favorite Bible verse, and it is, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And that's Micah 6:8. Yes. So I try to live by that. So.
Well, it's a great one to live by. I think we also try to live by that one. I think we'd be better human beings if we could.
I agree.
And love God and love neighbor. That's common to Judaism and Christianity. I mean, that sums up, I think, the whole Bible. Love God and love neighbor. And the ways in which you do that, hopefully for the betterment of humanity, is what we're about.
I am
it's definitely for
thankful.
It's definitely for the betterment of us and our podcast that you joined us today. I hope that you stay close and join us again, because you always have the wisest words. I'm always retweeting you and coming to you with things that, I feel so comfortable discussing with you anyway. So we're very lucky to have you on, Father Beck. And Jim, I think until next time, we rest.
We rest.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I really feel honored to be able to have joined you.